I froze when I saw my wife take off our wedding ring and put on her bosses during the company couple's dinner. So I went to them and said, "Cherish, the marriage is over here." I left with my head held high and my heart in ruins, leaving behind the one who had already left me inside. In the following months, she realized her boss only wanted fun and never considered commitment. Alone, she tried to salvage what he had destroyed with that gesture. I gradually rebuilt my life alongside a new love, someone who values loyalty and sees me with truth. When she came to me, repentant, I listened in silence. I forgave her with a clean heart, but without turning back. Forgiveness sealed the end, each with their own choices, each on their own path. After that dinner, I was never the same. And not because of wounded pride or vanity, but because of something deeper, the feeling of having been ripped from my own home with my feet still on the ground. She looked me in the eyes as she slid our wedding ring onto her finger, turning it slowly, as if changing futures, history, time. And with the same ease as someone choosing a dish from a menu, she placed the other one, cold, new, shiny, as if what we'd experienced was nothing more than a rehearsal. And when the others toasted, amid smiles and compliments, my voice cut through the room, "You may toast, the marriage is over here." I saw their faces freeze, their glasses suspended in the air, her gaze contorting between surprise and guilt, but I didn't hesitate. I turned my back on what I once called home and walked away. It was only the beginning of the end, but at that moment, I didn't know how much more it would affect me. In the days that followed, I became a specter in my own world. The silverware made no sound, the rooms echoed empty, her clothes, still in the closet, had a smell that stung. The bed was too big. The kitchen too small for silence. And the messages, all ignored, came cold, curt, as if her urgency could make up for her haste in leaving me. I wanted to scream, to break everything, to cry until I forgot my name, but instead, I sank into silence. Because silence holds what even words can't bear. She tried to justify it. She said it was an impulse, that she felt invisible, that the other person made her laugh, that I was distant. Me? Distant? I was by her side every day caring, listening, trying to get it right. But maybe that was the mistake, being too much. Being too predictable. Being too honest. Being too real. And in a world of appearances, those who truly love run the risk of being dismissed as too old, too easy. And she wanted adrenaline, she wanted someone who made her feel desired, alive, powerful. She wanted the kind of attention that comes packaged in empty compliments, in promises that last forever. She had that. She had the allure of the new. She had the butterflies in her stomach of the forbidden. But when the heat wore off, when the novelty became routine, when her boss started arriving late, leaving early, not responding to messages with the same enthusiasm, she realized it wasn't love. It was just ego. It was just vanity being stroked by a man who collected adventures. And she was just one more. While she dealt with the void she created, I slowly began to pick up the pieces of what was left of me. It was a slow, painful, almost unbearable process. Relearning to live without her was like relearning to walk on one leg. But at some point, the pain turned to strength. And strength turned to peace. And peace, when it arrived, brought someone. Someone who didn't ask for promises, who didn't compare scars, who simply stayed. Who looked at me as if seeing beyond what was left. Who held my hand not to fix me, but to walk with me slowly. And on this new path, I rediscovered what I had lost, faith in love. But fate, as always, loves irony. Because it was just when I was no longer thinking about her that she knocked on the door. Her eyes sunken, her hair disheveled, her voice choked. She spoke of longing, of regret, of sleepless nights. She said she didn't know what she was doing, that she had been weak, that she thought of me every day. That the other man ignored her, that he was already with someone else, that she had been left with nothing but her own broken reflection. I heard it all. Without interrupting. Without anger. Without resentment. Because in that moment, I understood she wasn't there for me. She was there for herself. For the guilt she wanted to get off her chest. For the past she wanted to try to redeem. But I was no longer the same man. And she was no longer the woman I loved. Time had done what love could not, separate us forever. I said I forgave her. And I did. Not for her. But for myself. To free myself. To close that chapter. So she could move on in peace, and so could I. But I didn't go back. And she understood. Or pretended to understand. Because days later, she still tried. She tried again. Until she saw there was no more space. What she destroyed with a gesture cannot be rebuilt with words. And that's when it happened. I was walking in a park with the woman who was now my partner. We were laughing about something silly, and her son, a 5-year-old boy, ran up to me, grabbed my hand, and said, "Dad, look at this." I bent down, smiled, and showed him what was in the leaves. It was a ladybug. So small, so alive. When I looked up, she was there. The woman who left me for another. She stood there, alone, watching the scene as if she were watching the life she had let slip away. Our eyes met. For a second, I felt a pang in my chest. Not of love. But of memory. Of everything that could have been and wasn't. She lowered her head, as if understanding that this moment was no longer hers. That "Dad," spoken by another child was the loudest sound in the silence that now surrounded her. She lost me there. For real. Not when I took off my ring. Not when I closed the door. But when she saw me happy with someone other than her. When she saw that love, the one she threw away, was reborn somewhere else, without anger, without shouting, without revenge. Only love. And that she, with all her attempts to return, was no longer part of my story. But there was still something she didn't know. Something that happened in the midst of it all. Something that began with a lost message, a silent confession, and that would forever change the way she viewed the past. Something I kept hidden. Not for revenge, but because some truths need silence to mature. And when she found out, it was too late. And that's why this story needs to be told. Because it's not just about betrayal. It's about the value of true love. About the consequences of thoughtless choices. About how, sometimes, we only realize what we've lost when we see someone else happy with what they had. It's about the pain of those who stayed. About the regret of those who left. And about the weight of a gesture that, however simple it may seem, can forever bury an entire future. She thought she could go back. But life had already moved on. Welcome to the channel. Here, betrayal will never be romanticized. It is the poison that corrodes relationships, destroys lives, and leaves scars that time doesn't always erase. All the stories told are fictional, but the feelings are real, and the moral is clear: those who choose to betray, choose to lose. Brace yourself, what you're about to hear is more than a story. It's a reality check. Ethan and Sarah seemed the picture of a couple who had found, all too soon, what many spend a lifetime searching for. He, with his serene eyes and discreet demeanor, was the kind of man who spoke little but said everything with his gestures. He knew how to listen without interrupting, care without suffocating, and love without demanding. Sarah, on the other hand, was a light, full of life, restless, with a smile that brightened even the most ordinary days. She had this energy that attracted people and transformed places. When they arrived in each other's lives, it wasn't an explosion, it was a fitting. Neither of them was looking for anything, but when they saw each other, there was this comfortable silence, this unexpected calm, as if they had returned home after a long journey. They started slowly, between coffees and walks, and gradually they became one, not through overwhelming passion, but through something even stronger, the intimacy built day after day. They lived in a quiet neighborhood, with trees lining the sidewalks and small cafes on the corners. The apartment was simple, but full of details that spoke volumes about them. Paintings with quotes chosen by Sarah, books organized by Ethan, a blanket always thrown on the sofa, familiar smells wafting from the kitchen, and a playlist that played softly through the house on lazy afternoons. They lived there for 5 years, amid conversations on the porch, dinners cooked together, movies slept in between, and dreams shared before bed. It wasn't a fairy tale, it was a true story, full of imperfections, small disagreements, fatigue, and routine, but there was care, and that was enough. Ethan was methodical, organized, a man of habit. He worked in financial management and was known for being reliable, stable, almost predictable. Sarah, on the other hand, was spontaneous, worked in the creative sector of a communications company, surrounded by ideas, projects, and people with strong opinions. The difference between them, rather than separating them, seemed to balance them. On weekends, she liked to take him to exhibitions, cultural events, places that took him off balance. And he took her on trails, to the silence of nature, to escape the noise. He taught her to breathe, she taught him to move. They lived in this rhythm of exchange, and for a long time, they believed that would be enough to keep everything going. When they married, the ceremony was small but charged with truth. There was no ostentation, but instead tears, sincere laughter, and promises made eye to eye, promises that said more than any ring could ever convey. Friends said they completed each other. Their families seemed at peace seeing them together. Everything indicated stability, connection, a long future. But, as happens in the most common and, therefore, the most painful stories, what seemed solid began to crack in the small details, silently. Routine began to take over where there had once been novelty. Conversations became more matter-of-fact, displays of affection less spontaneous. Sarah, with her restless heart, missed something she couldn't name. Ethan, stuck in his own patterns, didn't realize she was slowly drifting away, even though she was still physically present. She arrived late, saying it was work. He believed her. Not out of naivete, but out of trust. He was the kind of man who saw no point in distrusting the one you loved. And that was perhaps his biggest mistake. At the same time, she began to subtly change. The once natural sparkle in her eyes seemed more manufactured. Her touch, once spontaneous, now seemed calculated. The pauses in conversations lengthened. The "I love you"s began to come at predictable moments, as an obligation, and no longer as a pulsating truth. Ethan noticed, but didn't say it. Maybe out of fear. Maybe because he didn't know what to do with this new space that was beginning to emerge between them. She, in turn, found herself torn between the life she'd built and a restlessness that grew with each passing day. There was a part of her that wanted more intensity, more desire, more validation. Something she could no longer find in his eyes, no matter how hard she looked. It wasn't a lack of love, but perhaps a kind of love that had become complacent. That had become too much of a certainty in a world she felt needed surprises. And in that empty space, new presences, new conversations, new possibilities emerged. Ethan, oblivious to the gathering storm, tried to keep everything going. He made dinner on nights when she arrived exhausted, bought flowers for no reason, complimented her new haircut even without realizing exactly what had changed. He tried, in his own way, to keep a flame alive that was already burning alone. And he believed, with all his might, that love was enough. That caring was enough to not lose it. But he didn't know that sometimes, no matter how much you care for something, someone on the other side has stopped wanting to hold on. There was also the pressure of the world around her. The idea that everything had to be perfect. Social media showed dinners, trips, declarations. Sarah looked and wondered if she had chosen right, if she was living the life she should. She began to compare, to question, to long for a kind of excitement not found in stable marriages. And she began to distance herself from those she loved, chasing an adrenaline rush that might not even exist in a suit, only her promise. Ethan, increasingly lost, tried to decipher what had changed, but received vague answers. "It's just work, I'm tired," "It's not about you, it's about me." And he believed her. Because he still saw in her the woman he had fallen in love with. He still saw traces of her smile, still smelled the afternoons they spent together, still remembered the day she cried as she watched him wait at the altar. He still loved, just as strongly as before. But he loved alone. Friends began to notice. Comments surfaced. Signs were given. But Ethan, always rational, always true to his own convictions, preferred not to anticipate a pain he wasn't yet sure existed. He preferred to believe it was just a phase. That everything would fall into place. That with patience and love, everything would be fixed. Sarah, meanwhile, created a parallel reality. One where her needs spoke louder than her commitments. Where momentary desire overrode the value of years of history. And in doing so, she was leaving behind, without realizing it, a love she might never find again. Because true love isn't found out there, isn't manufactured in casual encounters, isn't rebuilt with the same material once it's broken. Time passed, and the apartment that had once been a shelter became nothing more than a roof. The silences grew longer. The conversations, shorter. But even so, there were attempts. There was effort. Ethan didn't give up easily. He wasn't the type to run away. He was the type who stayed. Who waited. Who believed. And this faith, this persistence, this silent fidelity, was all he had left to offer. Their story still existed. But it was no longer written by their shared hands. And without him knowing it, the end had already begun to take shape. Not with an abrupt breakup. But with small, daily decisions. With absences disguised as weariness. With lies told sweetly. With hurried kisses and memorized apologies. Their love didn't end all at once. It died slowly, like a candle forgotten in a closed room. And while one still clung to the memory of what they were, the other was already experiencing the taste of something new. Something that came with adrenaline, yes. But also with risks, emptiness, insecurities. Something that seemed intense but never felt deep. Sarah didn't know this yet. Or she did, but didn't want to admit it. And so, between the comfort of what she had built and the excitement of what she believed she was discovering, she walked toward a choice from which she would never be able to return with clean hands. There was still no betrayal. But there was no loyalty anymore. And in the midst of it all, Ethan was still there. Making coffee, folding clothes, planning a trip for them both. Still believing their love was worth saving. Still thinking the silence was just a phase. Still trusting, like someone building castles by the sea without noticing the rising tide. And while he planned tomorrow, she no longer knew where she'd left yesterday. Sarah began to wear a deafening silence that Ethan didn't know how to break. He noticed her absences even when she was present, the distance in her responses, her eyes that seemed fixed elsewhere, and the hugs that no longer lasted as long as before. The mornings began to pass too quickly, as if she always had something more important to pursue, and the nights, cold and formal, left a bitter feeling in his chest, as if he were sharing a bed with a stranger. Ethan, true to what he believed to be true love, refused to create stories in his own head. He preferred to believe it was a phase, that it all reflected the stress of work, the weight of routine, the common wear and tear that every relationship goes through. But there was something in the way she avoided eye contact, in the cell phone always face down, in the messages she silently typed in the corner of the sofa, that screamed a truth he didn't want to hear. She, in turn, lived a silent conflict that consumed her. She felt guilt, yes, but not enough to stop. She feared losing everything she'd built, but at the same time, she clung to the feeling of newness like someone holding onto the edge of a cliff with her nails. The other man, with whom she exchanged longer glances in the office and hidden laughs in the hallways, seemed to offer exactly what she missed and couldn't even define. It was as if each exchanged phrase was a spark igniting something that had lain dormant. The danger of the forbidden, the allure of the unknown, the warmth of the gaze of someone who didn't know her completely, all of this caused Sarah's days to be divided between what she had and what she longed for, without knowing exactly why. The excuses began to surface more frequently. After-hours meetings, corporate dinners, last-minute trips. Ethan, believing what he saw, offered support and understanding. He said he admired her dedication to her work, that he was proud to have such a determined wife. And each time he said it, Sarah felt diminished. Because behind his pride, she felt dirty. At the same time, it was as if each new transgression built more courage within her, as if the mistake gained layers of emotional justification. She began to convince herself that it wasn't entirely her fault. That Ethan no longer saw her as he used to, that the marriage had cooled, that she was just trying to find herself again. But deep down, she knew. She knew she was betraying not only a man, but herself. She knew she was killing a story to live a chapter that might never end. Meanwhile, Ethan kept trying. He cooked dinners, suggested short trips, organized weekends out of town. He wanted to rekindle what had once been a fire but now barely warmed. Moments of intimacy were scarce, and when they did exist, they were mechanical, as if their bodies were there out of obligation, not desire. Conversations that once stretched into the wee hours now barely lasted a coffee. And the silence between them, once comfortable, now screamed everything unsaid. Still, Ethan persisted. Not out of blindness, but out of hope. Because he believed that true love was patient, that it endured, that it understood the difficult times and fought to overcome them. He didn't know he was fighting alone. The days dragged on with the weight of a broken routine. Ethan started coming home earlier, trying to be more present, trying to understand if there was anything he could do. He watched her habits change, the impatience with small gestures, the rush to leave, the disinterest in everything they had. The playlist that once intoxicated the apartment with shared music was replaced by the silence of her headphones. The couch became a trench. The bed, a divided territory. And love, a memory suffocated by emotional distance. And then came the invitation. Her company was hosting a couple's dinner, something Sarah hesitated to mention but eventually revealed with some resistance, as if she had no other choice. Ethan, excited by the idea of reconnecting, saw it as a chance to get closer, to better understand what was going on in her world. He carefully chose his outfit, prepared to talk, to smile, to be part of something. But Sarah seemed tense. She even suggested he not go, saying it might be boring, that she might be tired. But he gently insisted, with that look that said all he wanted was to be by her side. That night at dinner, Ethan noticed a different atmosphere. It wasn't just the elegant setting or the wine glasses being raised in empty toasts. There was a disconnect in Sarah's gaze, a contained discomfort, as if his presence were out of place. Her gaze wasn't directed at him, but at another point in the room. A point he instinctively began to observe. And that's when he saw it. A man, with a confident posture and a practiced smile, was approaching with all too familiarity. The way Sarah smiled back, the way she fixed her hair, the way she tried to hide her tension, all of it stabbed Ethan like an invisible dagger. The conversations unfolded, and even without proof, Ethan could already feel it. It wasn't unjustifiable jealousy. It was the reading of a body he knew all too well, of gestures that had once been his, of smiles that had lost their naturalness. As the evening progressed, Sarah seemed torn between feigning normalcy and controlling her impulses. The man spoke confidently, gave her furtive glances, and subtly touched her arm as he said goodbye. Ethan watched it all, silent. Not out of cowardice, but out of respect. He still wasn't sure. I still wanted to believe he was imagining it. But the truth grew inside him like an unbreakable knot. It was at dessert time that the unthinkable happened. Amidst conversation, laughter, and toasts, Sarah discreetly removed her wedding ring. Not as if playing with the ring, but as if renouncing something. And then, with a restrained, almost imperceptible gesture, she placed the ring handed to her by the man next to her on her finger. It all happened in seconds, but for Ethan, time stood still. The sounds of the surroundings faded, the laughter became distant echoes, and all he could see was the image of his wife exchanging rings in front of everyone, without ceremony, without remorse. The betrayal was no longer a suspicion. It was a scene, a symbol, a sentence. The impact didn't come with screams. It came with the silent pain of someone dying standing up. Ethan stood, walked toward them, looked into her eyes, and said in a firm but broken voice, "You may toast. The marriage is over here." And then he left. Not out of weakness, but because it was the end. The end of a story he tried to save alone. The end of a promise broken without words. The end of everything that was once love. That night, Ethan's world fell silently apart. But what he didn't yet know, what he hadn't even imagined, was that that was only part of the truth. Because there was something more. Something Sarah had hidden even after everything. A secret that, when revealed, would change the meaning of everything he believed he had experienced. And there was no going back. The morning that began with a clear sky and a Sunday silence seemed insignificant compared to what was to come. Ethan woke early, even though he hadn't slept well in weeks. Since the dinner where he left everything behind, he had distanced himself not only from Sarah, but from everything that reminded him of what had been. The house where they lived together was now empty, the furniture they had chosen with such care seemed like nothing more than empty spaces. He spent more time outside, wandering aimlessly, reading in cafes they had never frequented, trying to make sense of the shattered state of something he had built with such dedication. He wasn't searching for answers. He was searching for himself. There was no longer anger, no hatred, only a melancholic emptiness of someone who still didn't understand how everything could have fallen apart so quickly. And it was during one of those lonely mornings that the unexpected happened. Sarah appeared. She stood at the gate, red-eyed, makeup-free, her hair tied up messily, and an expression of shame. He saw her through the window and took a few seconds to decide whether to open the door or not. When he did, he remained silent, waiting for her to take the initiative. She simply said she needed to talk, that she didn't want to argue, that she had no intention of rekindling or justifying things, but that there was something he needed to know. Ethan didn't respond immediately. He watched, measuring her words and gestures, trying to understand the intention behind this late visit. She entered slowly, like someone returning to a crime scene, and sat on the edge of the sofa, as if unsure how to occupy the space. He remained standing, arms crossed, distant but attentive. Sarah began by saying she expected neither forgiveness nor understanding, and that she wouldn't make any speeches about shared blame or a marital crisis. She admitted, with a choked voice, that she had made selfish choices, that she had let herself be carried away by a disguised lack of freedom, by an illusion that seemed pleasurable but was ultimately empty. Ethan listened without interrupting. Inside, his heart sank, not because he still harbored hope, but because each word confirmed what he had tried to ignore for so long, that he had been betrayed not by just one act, but by a series of small decisions, omissions, and silent distancing. When she finished, she lowered her head and remained silent, as if awaiting a verdict. But he remained silent. There was something in her eyes that told her this wasn't the end of it. It was then that Sarah took a deep breath, looked directly at him, and said she needed to tell him something she'd kept hidden all along, even after the separation. Something she'd never had the courage to admit, not even to herself. She said the hardest day wasn't when he left her in that dining room, nor when the other man disappeared from her life as if nothing had happened, but the day she saw him in the park, with another woman and a child. She said that on that day, everything she tried to hide from herself came flooding back like a punch to the chest. Because in that scene, in that genuine happiness she'd seen from afar, she realized not only what she'd lost, but the extent of the destruction she'd caused. But that wasn't all. Sarah then revealed that same night, after seeing him in the park, she decided to return to the office to pick up some things she'd left in her former boss's office. It was a symbolic gesture, an attempt to close a circle. She'd expected to find no one, but what she found changed everything. There, in the dark hallway, she heard laughter coming from his office. And as she approached, she saw him with another employee, using the same gestures, the same words, the same promises he'd made to her before. It was like watching a rerun, a performance. And it was there, in that moment, that she understood she'd never been special, never chosen, never loved. She'd been just a distraction. A temporary ornament in a game of vanity. She collapsed in the car that night, crying until she couldn't breathe. But even that, painful as it was, wasn't the secret he'd come to reveal. Ethan remained still, his gaze fixed, his hands now trembling. He sensed something yet to come, something that might touch him more deeply than anything he'd ever heard. Sarah continued. She said that, during the time of their estrangement, when she was already involved with the other man but hadn't yet left home, she began to feel emotionally divided. She said that on a particular night, before the physical betrayal occurred, she had a crisis of conscience. She was confused, conflicted, and decided to write a letter. A letter to Ethan. Not to confess, but to explain herself. She wanted him to know that she was lost, that it wasn't about him, that she still loved him but couldn't find herself in that relationship anymore. The letter remained hidden among the books on the office shelf, waiting for the right moment to be delivered. But that moment never came. Shortly after, Sarah continued with her betrayal. Guilt and shame prevented her from saying anything. She simply let it all out at dinner and left that letter behind, forgotten, buried among the days that followed. When she left home for good, she took almost nothing. Ethan, in the process of reorganizing his life, also didn't rummage through his papers or revisit his bookshelves. It was only a month ago, after seeing Ethan happy with another woman, that she felt the urge to return to her old house, knowing he would be traveling, to retrieve some of her old books. That's where he found the letter. He opened it. He read it. And he no longer recognized its author. But again, that wasn't the worst of it. What Sarah would reveal now would change everyone's understanding of everything. What was coming now was the real impact, the final blow, the wound that wouldn't heal. She swallowed hard, hesitated, and then said that the moment in the park destroyed her not only because she saw Ethan happy with another woman, but because in that moment she heard, in so many words, something that tore her apart. She said that when the child called Ethan Dad, she knew she had lost everything. But what Ethan didn't yet know, what she never had the courage to tell him, was that the boy wasn't the woman's son. He was just a nephew. And that, weeks before the end, before everything fell apart, she herself had discovered she was pregnant. With Ethan. And she decided, out of fear, confusion, immaturity, to terminate the pregnancy without telling him. The impact of the words wasn't immediate. Ethan remained still, as if his brain refused to process them. His breathing became heavy, his eyes wide, his hands slowly dropping to his sides. Sarah continued speaking, through tears, saying she didn't know how to deal with it, that she felt incapable of being a mother, that if she told him, she would be trapping him in a relationship that was already fragile. And that, after everything fell apart, she thought it best to keep quiet. But seeing that scene in the park, hearing another child call him Dad, was like being thrown deep inside herself, where the echo of her choices was too loud to ignore. Ethan took 2 steps back. One for each word that cut him like a blade. Pregnant. He interrupted. Not to mention. Everything he had suffered up until that point now gained another layer. It wasn't just love he had lost. It was also the chance to start a family. To experience something that might have saved them both. Or not. But he would never know. The pain was physical. A tightness in his chest, a sudden dizziness. He sat without saying anything, his eyes fixed on some distant spot in the room. Sarah wept softly, without moving. The silence between them was thick, heavy, almost unbearable. When Ethan finally spoke, his voice was hoarse, low, as if he were speaking to himself. He asked why she hadn't trusted him. Why she deprived him of knowledge, of choice, of even feeling. She had no answer. Because no answer would be enough. It was late. Too late. He got up, went to the door, and opened it, unhurriedly, without anger. Only with the sadness of someone who now understood everything. And for that very reason, he could no longer stay. What Sarah destroyed wasn't just a marriage. It was an entire future. And now, by revealing the last secret she still held, everything was said. But not everything was felt. Because some pains, even spoken aloud, continue to scream inside. Sarah remained seated on the couch for several minutes after Ethan opened the door. There were no more words, no explanations, no pleas. She didn't get up immediately. She remained there, leaning forward, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the floor as if her shame could be buried beneath the carpet fibers. The sound of the door swinging open behind her was an invitation to the end, but also a line between everything that had been and everything that would never be again. Ethan didn't send her away with words, but the gesture, the quietest of all, was brutal. When he finally stood, without saying anything, she walked past him with short, hesitant steps, avoiding his gaze, and crossed the threshold as if crossing a border from which there was no return. He didn't close the door immediately. He remained still, staring at the emptiness she left behind, the seconds that followed, and the air still heavy with the scent of a past that no longer had a place there. In the days that followed, Ethan sank into a kind of emotional suspension. There was no longer anger, no shock, no sharp pain. What existed now was a kind of profound exhaustion, as if something inside him had been violently ripped out, and his body, even standing, hadn't yet realized it was hurt. He didn't reach out to friends, didn't respond to messages, and avoided people's gazes in the hallways at work. He simply functioned, like a machine, waiting for time, at some point, to make sense of everything. He didn't cry, didn't scream, but there was something in his expression that said more than any reaction, an absolute emptiness. Sarah's revelation had reached a layer he hadn't known existed. It wasn't just about being betrayed, nor about losing a love. It was about being robbed of the chance to be a father. About being removed from a choice that was also his, from a path he could never retrace. And this, no matter how much he tried to rationalize, devastated him inside. He moved house. Not out of necessity, but out of survival. Every room, every detail, every smell of the old residence tied him to what had been. The new house was smaller, simpler, and devoid of memories. He began reshaping everything, from furniture to habits. He started running in the morning, cooking at night, listening to new music. He created a new routine, forced and raw, but one that gave him the feeling of being in control. Little by little, he went out again. Not to look for someone, but to move. And it was in this new rhythm, in this attempt at a fresh start, that he met someone. It wasn't a romantic encounter, nor a sudden one. It was gradual. A discreet, sweet woman, with a firm gaze and sensible words. She didn't arrive to cure anything. She simply arrived and stayed. She had a young son, the result of a previous relationship that had ended years ago, and she carried a quiet maturity that contrasted with everything he had experienced. Ethan didn't fall in love immediately. But there was a connection. A calmness in her gaze, a kindness in the way she spoke of the world, a sincerity in her simple gestures that, over time, reminded him of what it meant to live lightly. He approached cautiously, still wounded, still suspicious, but also curious. Their conversations flowed without pressure, without demands, without games. The child, with her noisy innocence, occupied the space naturally, and unintentionally, opened a ray of light in Ethan. He began to feel something he had forgotten, hope. Not that the past could be erased, but that the future might, somehow, still be worth living. Meanwhile, Sarah grappled with absence. Not just Ethan's, but her own. After the confession, I expected some reaction, even if it was fury, contempt, some kind of closure. But she received only silence. And silence, in that context, was worse than any response. It was confirmation that everything had been irreversibly broken. He tried to return to work, but the office walls now seemed suffocating. The looks from his colleagues, previously admiration, were judgmental. His old boss had already been transferred, and the new management made it clear that his presence there was tolerated only by contract. He resigned weeks later. She returned to live with her parents for a while, in a house that no longer seemed to shelter a grown woman. The days dragged on between frustrated attempts to fill the void and memories that insisted on reviving the mistakes. One day, at the urging of a friend, she decided to go to a recently opened cafe. She wanted to see people, feel some movement, anything to remind her that life went on. And there, without planning, without preparation, the inevitable happened. Ethan walked in, accompanied by his new companion and the boy. The world stopped. Sarah watched them from afar, observing every gesture, every laugh, every look. The boy jumped around Ethan, showing her something he'd drawn, and he, with a sincere smile, bent down to listen attentively. The woman touched his shoulder naturally, and their table was enveloped by an energy Sarah no longer recognized as her own. That peace, that silent affection, that pure love, everything she once had and had thrown away. She didn't try to hide. She wanted to see it through to the end. She wanted to stare into her own eyes what she'd lost. When Ethan finally saw her, there was a moment of suspension in the air. He stopped, recognized her, and simply nodded, as if acknowledging a chapter closed. Sarah responded with a slight nod, her eyes watering, and didn't say a word. She left soon after, her body feeling triple the weight. At home, she lay down in the dark room and cried as if she could wash her soul away, but she knew there was no redemption there. She didn't want forgiveness to return. She just wished he hadn't gone on so well. That he had at least stumbled. But no. He was fine. More than fine. He was whole. Days later, a letter arrived. No return address, no perfume, no promises. Just a plain envelope with familiar handwriting. Inside, 2 pages. It was from Ethan. It wasn't a response to her visit, nor a reopening of the past. It was a farewell letter. In it, he said he needed to write to finally close the story inside himself. That for a long time he tried to understand the whys, the faults, the emptiness. But now he was no longer searching for meaning. Only acceptance. He wrote that the love he'd felt for her was real, and that was enough. That the pain he'd experienced had transformed him, but that he didn't hate her. That betrayal, however cruel, didn't erase the good times. But that some choices carry consequences. And that hers cost him a future he'd never have. He said he'd learn to forgive, not to free her, but to free himself. And he ended with a simple but definitive sentence: we were everything. Now we are nothing. And that's okay. Sarah held the letter with trembling hands, read and reread it, and for the first time, she felt a strange peace. It hurt, but it was liberating. There was nothing left to search for, nothing to explain. She was alone. And though she knew she would move on one day, she also knew she would never be loved like that again. And that, more than any punishment, was the true price she would have to pay for what she had done. Ethan, for his part, now saw life differently. He no longer carried dead weight. He no longer dreamed of what had been. He lived the present with dignity, with care, with love. The past was part of history, but it was no longer the story. That same night, as he tucked the boy into bed and his partner prepared dinner, Ethan looked out the window and thought that true love isn't lost completely. It only transforms into something that teaches you to never again settle for less than you deserve. And even though the pain was immense, he now knew, there is life after loss. There is love after ruin. And there is light where before there was only darkness. The days following the letter's delivery were quietly definitive. Ethan didn't expect a response, nor did he want one. That letter wasn't an invitation to dialogue, but a final point. It was the final gesture of someone who chose to move on in peace, even without reparation. After everything he'd been through, he no longer felt the need to listen to excuses or reopen wounds that, though healed, bore scars that would remain as a reminder of a love that ended in the most painful way possible. Ethan's heart no longer pounded heavily when he thought of Sarah, but there was no lightness either. What remained was a kind of forced maturity, a learning experience drawn from pain, like someone forced to mature in the face of a lack of choice. He now understood that some stories, no matter how intense and true, end unceremoniously, without warning, without emotional closure. And that forgiveness, though necessary, doesn't come to correct the past, but to prevent it from continuing to harm the present. Sarah, for her part, entered a period of profound silence. She no longer sought redemption or contact. Ethan's letter had put an end to any fantasies she still harbored. There was nothing left to hope for. And it was precisely in this space of stillness that she began to understand, with greater clarity, what loss truly meant. Before, the loss was abstract, pain mixed with pride, regret trying to disguise the ego. But now, it was concrete. It was a man she had moved on to, a story closed, a memory that no longer belonged to her. The solitude, once surrounded by noise and attempts at distraction, was now complete. And it was within herself that Sarah faced a dilemma she never imagined experiencing: how to carry on when you're no longer the same. When there's no one waiting for you at the end of the day. When even the mirror seems to reflect an unknown reflection. Ethan's absence in her life wasn't just the absence of a partner, it was the absence of someone who genuinely loved her, who saw beyond her imperfections, who was willing to stay even when things got difficult. This confrontation with her own emptiness led her to completely rethink her life. She changed apartments, neighborhoods, and routines. She left behind her old social circles, the peers who only supported her out of politeness, and began frequenting new places, where no one knew her. She started studying again, started painting again, something she'd done even before meeting Ethan, and approached her parents more genuinely, without trying to prove she was okay. Even so, each step was slow, as if the ground beneath her feet was still fragile. Deep down, she knew, she would never again be who she was by his side. She would never again be seen as she was seen. She had crossed a line, and even if she found peace, she would carry within her the knowledge of what she had destroyed with one gesture. Guilt, unlike pain, doesn't diminish with time. It settles, changes form, but remains. On the other side of the story, Ethan lived a more stable present. The new relationship wasn't made of exaggerated promises or theatrical declarations. It was a slow, real build, based on mutual respect and small gestures that reaffirmed their commitment to caring for each other. He had learned that true love isn't found in big moments, but in constancy. And perhaps because of that, he felt safer than ever. The woman by his side had her own story of loss, and this brought them closer. There was a silent understanding between them that love only blossoms where there is maturity. The boy, growing closer, had created deep bonds with Ethan, who, even though he wasn't his biological father, already wholeheartedly assumed the role of a firm and loving presence. Little by little, what was temporary became everyday life, and everyday life became home. But even with his new life stabilized, Ethan would sometimes be overcome by moments of introspection. Not of longing, but of reflection. Sometimes, alone on the porch, with a cup of coffee in hand, he would let his thoughts wander through everything he'd experienced, not as a desire to relive it, but as an exercise in understanding. He would think about the signs he'd ignored, the conversations he'd missed, the silences he'd accepted as normal. He didn't blame himself, but he understood that love also requires vigilance. That affection needs to be maintained like a flame, with care. And although he knew he wasn't solely responsible for the downfall, he recognized that love, to survive, must be chosen every day. And somewhere along the line, they both stopped choosing each other. One afternoon, while taking his son for a walk in the park, Ethan was approached by an elderly woman, the kind who strikes up a conversation without asking permission. She watched the two of them playing and, with a small smile, commented that it was beautiful to see a father so present. Ethan, surprised, replied that he wasn't his biological father, but rather someone who was doing the best he could. The woman looked at him tenderly and said that sometimes, the fathers who choose to be there are more important than those who were simply there out of obligation. This simple sentence had an unexpected impact. Ethan smiled, thanked her, and continued his walk, but something inside him shifted. For the first time, he felt he was exactly where he was supposed to be. And that perhaps, despite everything, the path he took after the fall had led him to a true place. Across town, Sarah walked down the sidewalk with a canvas under her arm. She was going to a trial class at a newly opened studio. She didn't know anyone there, and that was what she wanted. She was ready to rebuild her life from scratch, without trying to repeat the old one. Some days she woke up feeling refreshed, full of energy. Others, she fell into a dark pit of memories. But now she knew how to get out of it. Not with distractions, but with acceptance. She still felt deeply for everything, but she had learned that carrying regret didn't mean living in guilt. She needed to transform it into something useful. She wanted to be a better woman. For herself. Maybe one day, for someone else. But no longer out of need. Out of truth. Despite everything, fate seemed to maintain an invisible line between them, as if there was still something to be said. And this was confirmed in an unexpected moment. A charity event that brought together volunteers from various social projects in the region. Ethan had been involved with an institution that offered educational support to vulnerable children, while Sarah had volunteered to paint an artistic mural in partnership with the same project. When their names were announced, they both knew they would meet. Neither of them backed out. Not out of pride, but because they knew they were ready. And when the day arrived, the reunion happened without ceremony. A look. A greeting. And a respectful silence that said more than any words. They worked in different areas, but during the break, they ran into each other by chance in the event's makeshift cafeteria. They sat for a moment, without tension. Ethan commented enthusiastically on the project. Sarah praised the drawing he was making with the boy, displayed on the wall. It was a conversation between two people who knew who they were and yet managed to see each other with humanity. There, in that brief moment, something became clear to both of them, that the pain had passed, but the story remained. And that, despite the choices that led them down opposite paths, they had both learned. Ethan saw in her eyes no longer the face of the one who had hurt him, but of someone who had also suffered from their own failings. And Sarah, looking at him, no longer saw the man she had lost, but the man she had freed. There was, in that shared silence, a kind of peace that only time can offer. At the end of the day, before they said goodbye, Ethan wished her happiness, truly happiness. And she, with a restrained smile, replied that he already was. They both knew this was the final chapter of a story that could now be left alone. There would be no return, no new beginning, but there was something better, understanding. And maybe, just maybe, this was the closest thing to a dignified closure they could have. There was still life to be lived. There was still love to be built. But now, on different paths, with different hands. Their story was over, but what they had learned from each other would remain forever. Ethan left the event with a lightness he hadn't felt in a long time. The reunion with Sarah, unexpectedly serene, brought no confusion or regret. It was like a well-placed period on a sentence that had already ended. On the way home, he drove in silence, listening to the calm breathing of the boy sleeping in the back seat, his head bowed and his hands still stained with paint. He glanced in the rearview mirror and smiled, not the automatic, restrained smile of hard times, but a smile full of peace, like someone who, after weathering a long storm, finally finds a stretch of dry road. When they arrived, his new companion was waiting for them on the porch with a calm, affectionate look in his eyes. Ethan hugged her tighter than usual. For the first time in a long time, he felt completely whole. Not because he had erased the past, but because he had managed to leave what had once been exactly where it belonged. That night, after they put the boy to bed, they sat together in the living room, the lights dimmed, and he told her about their encounter. She listened without interrupting, with the respect of someone who knows that before there was an us, there was an important story. When he finished, she simply said she was proud of the way he handled everything, that she admired even more his ability to face pain with dignity. Ethan didn't respond immediately. He held her hand and, with a sincere look, said that if he had made it through all that and still been here, it was because she had helped him find himself again when he no longer recognized himself. Her response came with a silent kiss and a long hug. And in that embrace, he knew, a new beginning didn't need to be afraid of what came before. It could be new, true, and completely different from everything. Sarah, on the other hand, returned from the event in silence. She walked to her small apartment and sat before the canvas she had been painting for weeks, still unfinished, still confused. She looked at the colors, the lines, and for the first time understood that the canvas wasn't about pain, as she had thought. It was about absence. And not the absence of Ethan, but of herself. The woman she had been by his side had been lost even before the betrayal. She began to empty herself when she stopped communicating her fears, when she exchanged truths for silent fantasies, when she chose silence rather than face what hurt. And now, there, before the painting, she understood that her greatest betrayal wasn't with Ethan, but with herself. Trying to be everything the other expected, she distanced herself from her own essence, and when she found herself lost, she sought outside what she no longer knew how to find within. She didn't cry. She was beyond crying. She felt something deeper, a genuine desire to rebuild herself, not to get someone back, but to find herself whole again. The following week, she decided to visit her parents, with whom she now had a more honest relationship, free from the veneer of perfection she'd so cultivated in the past. They talked about their childhood, about the old dreams he'd abandoned, about the fears he'd never confessed. For the first time in many years, she felt like a daughter. And this, though simple, brought a comfort I hadn't found in a long time. She told them she was thinking about moving to another city, starting over somewhere else, not to escape, but to breathe new air, to discover new versions of herself. Her mother cried, her father hesitated, but they both understood. They knew she needed to leave, and perhaps, finally, she was ready. Ethan, meanwhile, immersed himself in new projects. His involvement with the educational center grew. He began giving short talks on financial literacy for young people, organizing community events, and without even realizing it, he became a silent figurehead among the families served by the project. He began receiving thank you letters, invitations to participate in council meetings, and suggestions from parents seeking guidance. And the more he helped, the stronger he became. He was no longer just the man who had been betrayed. He was now the man who, after his fall, chose to rise with dignity and transform his pain into concrete action. One random Sunday, he decided to take his partner and the boy to explore a hidden trail he often visited alone. It was a peaceful place, with a sweeping view and an embracing silence. They climbed slowly, chatting about trivialities, laughing at inside jokes, and when they reached the top, they sat together and looked out over the city below. The boy, excited, ran back and forth, collecting leaves and twigs. She rested her head on Ethan's shoulder and whispered that this moment was all she needed. He looked at her and replied that, for the first time, he felt that way too. It was the kind of love that doesn't shout, doesn't demand, doesn't hurt. It was light, sincere, possible. And there, in that corner of the world, he knew, he was ready to write a new story, with a new family, without forgetting where he came from, but without carrying the weight of someone who was once destroyed. A few weeks later, Sarah embarked on her move. She chose a smaller, less hectic, more humane city. She rented a small house near a square, enrolled in an art therapy course, and began working in a community studio. She started from scratch, without titles, without masks, simply with the desire to rebuild her life more truthfully. She didn't talk about the past, but she didn't hide it either. She knew that, at some point, she would find someone new, and when that happened, she wanted to be ready to love with maturity, with honesty, with the clear conscience of someone who had learned from their own mistakes. Sometimes, walking alone at night, she remembered Ethan, not with pain or a desire to get back together, but with respect. He had been the great love of her life. And although she had lost him, she now understood that some people come to teach us, and that, once we've learned, we must let them go. Ethan and Sarah never saw each other again after the charity event. There were no calls, no messages, no indirect messages. Their story ended there, with the maturity of someone who accepts that not everything they love can be fixed. But the impact they had on each other's lives continued. Each, in their own way, chose a path of rebuilding. And it is precisely at this point that the story begins to touch on a profound moral dilemma. Because it's not just about betrayal, pain, and forgiveness. It's about the choices each made after the mistake. Sarah could have wallowed in guilt, but she chose to grow. Ethan could have closed himself off to love, but he chose to start over. Neither emerged unscathed. They both lost something irretrievable. But they also gained something many never achieve, clarity about what it means to truly love someone, and what it means to lose that love through a thoughtless choice. The dilemma that remains isn't whether Sarah deserved a second chance, or whether Ethan should have forgiven her differently. The dilemma lies in the question that echoes deep within the soul of anyone who has listened to this story thus far: if it were you, would you have returned? Would you have been able to love again after such pain? Or would you have chosen the path of escape, of resentment, of safe solitude? Ethan chose life. Sarah chose truth. And in the end, despite all the losses, they both reached places where they could breathe. Not all stories need reconciliation to be complete. Sometimes, a dignified closure is enough. And it's precisely this kind of closure that, even painful as it may be, gives the listener the certainty that everything they experienced had a purpose. Sarah's true punishment wasn't abandonment, nor loneliness. It was knowing she had been loved by someone who would never love her again. And that the love she sought elsewhere, was already at home, all along. Ethan woke to the sound of light rain hitting the window. It wasn't a different morning than any other, but there was something in the air, a sense of completeness he couldn't yet name. He got up calmly, walked through the living room where his toys were scattered in the corner, and made coffee with the slow movements of someone who's learned not to rush. Life had become simpler, quieter, but also richer in meaning. Over the months, he had rediscovered pleasures that didn't involve grand feats, just genuine moments. It was there, in the details, that he felt complete. His relationship with his new partner had matured naturally, like a tree growing unnoticed, until one day, looking around, he noticed the shadow she was already casting. The boy called him father naturally, and this no longer caused surprise, only gratitude. Ethan no longer needed to prove anything. He had found his place, not as someone else's replacement, but as himself, whole, present, rebuilt. A few weeks after that silent reunion at the event, Sarah had followed through on her decision to move to another city. She carried few bags, but had learned a lot. She settled into an artistic community where she was just another person, without a surname, without a history, without weight. She began teaching workshops to young people, teaching not only painting techniques, but also about expression, about transformation through art. Gradually, she was recognized not for who she had been, but for who she was becoming. There were days when she looked in the mirror and didn't like what she saw, but she learned not to shy away from her reflection. She began writing down thoughts in notebooks, reading more, writing letters she didn't send. Her new life was lonely but dignified. She knew she would never get back what she lost, and she no longer lived for that. I just wanted to avoid making the same mistakes, and that, in itself, was a huge purpose. A year after their final separation, fate, as if in a final gesture of irony or poetic justice, crossed their paths once again. This time, not by accident or event, but by choice. A formal invitation reached Ethan, a group exhibition of volunteer artists who had impacted social projects across the country. Sarah was one of the participants, and her name no longer caused the same discomfort. Ethan hesitated for a moment, but decided to go. Not for her, but for himself. For everything he had left behind. He arrived accompanied, as always, but this time with the boy by the hand, and found a serene environment, full of colors and stories told on canvas. When he came across the work signed by Sarah, he stopped. The painting was abstract, but there was something familiar in the color palette, in the firm yet disordered lines. It wasn't a disguised apology, nor an attempt at symbolic reconciliation. It was a silent message from someone who understood their own guilt and had found a new path through it. Ethan looked, contemplated, and then followed. Sarah, who had been watching him from afar, watched him leave without exchanging glances, but smiled lightly. That was the answer she needed. To know he was okay. To know his presence no longer weighed heavily. And that was all. Time, merciless and generous at the same time, took its course. Ethan began to dedicate more time to educating young people, helping couples in difficulty organize their finances, but also to reflect on their values. He began to use his own story as an example, not to judge, but to warn. He didn't speak of Sarah with resentment. He spoke of the importance of choosing wisely every day, of cultivating what you love before absence leads to disinterest. Over time, he became a local figure, not as someone who succeeded through success, but as someone who rebuilt his life with dignity. Years later, he officially married his new partner in a small, discreet, yet meaningful ceremony. The boy walked in with the rings, and when Ethan looked into the eyes of the woman he now called his wife, he knew he had reached the end of a cycle. Life, with all its tragedies and silent miracles, had given him a second chance. And this time, he wouldn't let it slip away. Sarah followed a different path. She didn't remarry, nor did she seek a new great love. Her new beginning was made of small bonds, sincere friendships, and honest exchanges. Her life found purpose in her work with young people, in the way she welcomed stories of pain and transformation. She became a mentor, a reference for many women who had also made mistakes and sought forgiveness, not from others, but from themselves. She still carried the pain of everything she had lost, but now that pain had transformed into service. In each canvas she painted, she left a little of everything she couldn't say out loud. Her works began to be recognized in larger spaces, and even when she received applause, she knew the true merit lay in the path she had taken to get there. She never saw Ethan again. She didn't need to. She knew he was happy. And that, after all, was also peace. Each character who walked through this story found an ending befitting their choices. Ethan, betrayed, wounded, but whole, found not only a new love but a new purpose, a new version of himself he might never have discovered had he not been broken. Sarah, who chose the easy way out in a moment of weakness, lost what was most precious to her, but had the courage to face the consequences and transform her pain into something that could help others. There was no vengeful justice, no fanciful rewards. There was truth. And this truth, hard and irrefutable, built an ending that doesn't require reconciliation to be complete. If you've made it this far, you've certainly experienced the layers of this story firsthand. Comment below with your thoughts, which character resonated with you the most, and if you would have made any of the choices differently. Your opinion is crucial and helps us continue bringing you stories that touch, provoke, and inspire reflection. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to receive more stories like this. Here, we do not and will never support any kind of betrayal. This channel exists to show how this kind of choice can destroy not only relationships, but entire lives. Betrayal hurts not only the other person, but also the perpetrator. It robs the right to build a clean future, erases memories, breaks families, and leaves scars that, even when they heal, never return to smooth skin. Remember, a moment of pleasure can cost a lifetime of regret. True love requires courage, commitment, and loyalty. And once that's broken, there's no going back to how it was before. So, protect those you love. Choose responsibly. And never trade a true story for a fleeting illusion.